India and China are never going to become good friends, and you shouldn't aim to become good friends, but you should aim to work together where your interests converge.
Welcome to India Today Global. I'm Shashank Patu, standing next to one of Singapore's and one of Asia's really most distinguished diplomats and thinkers on geopolitics, Kishore Mahbubani. Ambassador Mahbubani, thank you so much for joining us. I have a lot of things I would like to ask you, but let me start with this. The question on everyone's mind right now is the state of the U.S China relationship, a relationship that will very much define the future of the Asian century, as you have called it. Where do you see the state of relations right now with Donald Trump in office? He's made some conciliatory statements towards China, but also launched tariffs towards them. What exactly are we seeing in terms of the U.S China relationship?
Well, I think you're seeing a paradoxical dimension in the U.S China relationship. Paradoxical because on the one hand, there's no question that Donald Trump has stepped up the pressure on China. And, he's increased the tariffs and China has retaliated. So it's possible to see, in a sense, relations becoming more difficult between the two. But on the other hand, the big difference between President Joe Biden and President Donald Trump is that President Joe Biden's priority was in some way or another to slow down or stop China's growth because he saw China as a competitor. And to some extent, Donald Trump sees it too. But at the same time, Donald Trump's mission is to make America great again. And if he thinks that a big economic or trade deal between U.S. and China can help achieve that, he's ready to make a deal. So in that sense, you have, in a sense, there's grounds for pessimism, but also grounds for optimism in the U.S.-China relationship. We'll have to wait and see what happens when the two leaders meet.
Right. Could you tell us a little bit about, when you talk about this U.S.-China deal, a number of countries within the region seem to be fairly uncertain about a deal like that. Japan, Korea, especially India to some degree has also seen some sense of perhaps concern about what such a deal would look like. What would you say to those countries about the possibility of a U.S.-China deal?
Well, I think, Singapore is part of Southeast Asia and ASEAN. And from the part of the ASEAN countries in Southeast Asia, we've always said we want to have good relations with the United States and we want to have good relations with China. So some stability and predictability in the relationship between US and China will be good for our region. Because on the other hand, for example, if the trade war gets out of control and both sides keep increasing their tariffs, that will create a serious economic downturn, which will be very bad for our region. Right. So it's in our interest to see some stability in the U.S.-China relationship. They'll never become friends. Right. But if they can get along with each other in a business-like fashion, that's what would be good for the region. Right. Because our priority right now is to keep our economic growth going.
Could I ask you one question about a lot of countries in Asia, particularly here in India, have been looking at sort of the blowout fight between Zelensky and Trump in the White House. There's been this sense that, look, if Trump is willing to sideline Europe and Zelensky to reach a deal with the Russians, could he also sideline other Asian countries when it comes to reaching a deal with China? What do you think about that?
Well, I think, as you know, the Ukraine story is complicated. Everyone sees Donald Trump bullying President Zelensky, and it's a bit unfortunate. But at the same time, President Trump's goal is to bring peace into Ukraine, to stop a war. And I'm shocked that the Europeans don't seem to understand that in some ways an end of the war will be good for them. And the Europeans have been geopolitically very incompetent because they put all their geopolitical eggs in one basket in the United States. And suddenly when Donald Trump turns around and says, I have other priorities, the Europeans haven't prepared themselves for other eventualities. And so this is the big difference between Europe and East Asia. In East Asia, we are very pragmatic. We try not to take sides. We try to be friends with everyone. And if the Europeans had been geopolitically smarter, they could have helped to prevent this war in Ukraine by showing some degree of understanding of the deep strategic concerns that Russia has. So the Europeans themselves have made mistakes which have led to this present dilemma that they are in. And the Europeans should reflect deeply on what they need to do differently now.
Could I ask you one final question about Asia and how it's looking at Trump? There was a statement that came, of course, from the Singaporean defense minister about Trump being like a landlord seeking rent. There is this question these days about American transactionalism. Some people have suggested that, look, America's always been transactional with Asia. We don't exactly share values as such. Could you tell us a little bit about Trump's style, the way he deals with countries? Is that and American reliability? Big questions about whether you can continue to rely on American defense equipment, for example, if, as with Ukraine, there has been a question about whether they will cut off access, refuse to give data, and so on. America has been a key security provider for many countries in Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia, Singapore especially. Could you tell us a little bit about how countries will look at Trump's reliability?
Well, I can tell you that if you want to give Donald Trump a big compliment, you can compliment him on his honesty. Because the United States has always put its own interests first. And if it has to choose between its values and its interests, it will choose its interests first. So when it was no longer in the United States' interest to stop fighting the war in Vietnam, it left Vietnam despite the whatever consequences. Similarly, when it said it was very much wanted to protect the women of Afghanistan against the Taliban, but of course, when the crunch came, United States left Afghanistan. So the United States has a track record of putting its own interests first, and we understand that in East Asia. And by the same time, we also believe that the United States has a vested interest in a stable and prosperous East Asia and Asia at large, Indo-Pacific. So in that sense, we can actually work with American interests, because if Donald Trump is looking for markets for American products, the largest new middle classes are emerging in what I call the CIA countries. CIA is not Central Intelligence Agency, it's China, India, ASEAN. And out of the 3.5 billion people in China, India, and ASEAN, you had approximately only 150 million men enjoying middle class living standards in the year 2000. By 2020, the number exploded to 1.5 billion. By 2030, it will be closer to 2.5 to 3 billion. So this is the largest middle class population in the world. And it is in America's interest to work with this area, and that's what we appeal to. We don't appeal to America's ideals and values. We appeal to America's interest to stay engaged in our region.
Let me ask you two final questions. We've seen here in India this recent normalization of the India-China relationship, a change in tone as well. India's Prime Minister made a fairly conciliatory statement regarding China, about cooperation with China, not wanting conflict with the Chinese. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing there in terms of the normalization of the India-China relationship? How do you see this development?
Well, I must say I'm very happy that Prime Minister Modi referred to the 21st century as the Asian century. You know, my book has been downloaded almost 4 million times.
You very famously coined the term.
In 160 countries. So the whole world is psychologically preparing for the Asian century. But of course, the Asian century won't happen unless you have a stable and harmonious relationship between China and India. I'm very happy that Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said that there will be competition between China and India, but competition doesn't have to lead to conflict. And competition is not necessarily bad. It's actually good for economies to compete. So in that sense, I'm very encouraged by the statement that Prime Minister Narendra Modi made about the China-India relationship.
Let me ask you one final question. Sitting here in India over the last 4 or 5 years, as I'm sure you've... Sorry, I'm just going to cut this. My phone is ringing. Just a little bit. Sorry, I'm so sorry, sir. Yeah. So, sitting here in India, of course, over the last 4 to 5 years, we've seen a significant curdling of the public mood towards China. China is significantly seen in very negative terms, partly because of the border clashes in 2020. And there is a sense about restoring trust more broadly, but there is a sense very broadly among the Indian public, I'm sure among our audience as well, that China is a country that cannot be trusted. Now, you in the past have counseled young journalists like myself to not get emotional about geopolitics. Could you tell us a little bit about how, if you were speaking to the Indian public, about how they should view China? Because for the last 4 years, we've been told that it's an abnormal relationship. We can't trust China. Now, of course, there's a significant change of tone, and we know that we have to coexist with China. But at the same time, there's a sense of, can we trust them? How do we work with them if they have, been responsible for perfidy, in our opinion, in the past? How would you say that?
Well, I think it's important to understand that geopolitics is a very cold and cruel business. And countries that get emotional and don't do their rational long term calculations get into trouble, as the Europeans are getting into trouble now, because they were not cold and calculating in their analysis of what their strategic options are. So, in relations between countries, don't focus on trust, focus on interests. And where there's a convergence of interests, the countries can and should be able to work together. And the fundamental interest that China and India have is to grow their economies, because from the year 1 to the year 1820, the two largest economies of the world were always those of China and India. We fell back in the 200 years of Western domination. So what China and India's priorities are is to restore their natural position as two of the largest economies in the world. And they can achieve that interest better if they stabilize their relationship with each other and work with each other for mutual benefit. Now, India and China are never going to become good friends, and you shouldn't aim to become good friends, but you should aim to work together where your interests converge. And for India to emerge as a manufacturing power, in many ways, you have to still work with China, because by 2030, China's share of global manufacturing will be 45%. So all countries in the world rely on China for their components, so India too will rely on it. So having a stable relationship will be the best outcome. Don't try and say let's build trust with each other, because that may take 100 years.
Understood. Ambassador Mahbubani, thank you so much for your time and for speaking to us here on India Today Global.